with the South Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic Council, so you may see him doing some blue line tilefish work in the future. Little fun fact about Mike is that he played football at NC State for the North Carolina's commissioners. You can talk to him about that. And he recently, his son was recently born a couple months ago. So moved to DC, and we're excited to have him.
Nothing like a couple hours spent with friends, and that's what we hope to do for the next couple hours. You all have an agenda. Are there any changes suggested to the agenda? Are there any objections to approving the agenda as is? Seeing none, the agenda is approved. You all should also have proceedings from our August meeting. Are there any changes suggested for those proceedings? Are there any objections to approval of those proceedings? Seeing none, the proceedings are approved. I don't think that we have anyone signed up from the public to speak, but is there anyone from the public that would speak on items not on the agenda? Not seeing a big line of people rushing up to the speaker or to the microphone. We'll go on to item number 4, and that is consider draft COBIA FMP information document for public comment. And I think Dr. Daniel is going to present that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with y'all again. What I'd like to do real quickly is go through, you should all have a copy of the public information document in your briefing materials. That is was an excellent work completed by your plan development team that was developed between the last meeting and now. I can't say enough about the help that those folks did, and everyone on the plan development team was very involved and active in the development of this plan development public information document. And I just would like to say that at the very end of the presentation, I do have a couple of questions that were raised by the plan development team members that I would like to go through real quick to perhaps begin your discussion. Just to go over real quickly what I'd like to go through today, review the current issues, where we stand, have a brief discussion on the 2016 South Atlantic Council meeting down in Myrtle Beach that Executive Director Beal and I attended. And review the South Atlantic's Framework 4 to the Coastal Migratory Pelagics FMP to implement accountability measures to slow harvest in 2017. That was their primary objective in that discussion. And then review the PID and the proposed management issues for your consideration for going out to public meetings between now and the February meeting. Somewhat of a review from the last meeting with the white paper. As most of you know, the National Marine Fisheries Service announced a closure to the Atlantic Migratory Group COBIA effective June 20th of 2016 for exceeding the ACL. It was around 630,000 pounds, and landings were about 1.5 million pounds. We'll have some discussion over the methodology on which with which the landings data were accounted. The closure impacted the fishery throughout the range of the COBIA, but impacts were greatest for the Outer Banks of North Carolina and the states from Virginia to the northern extent of the range, as the quota ran out, and it seemed to be right during peak season, particularly for Virginia, that the closure occurred. And North Carolina and Virginia reacted to those closures by implementing some state-specific regulations to lessen the impact of that closure in 2016. Briefly, the 2013 COBIA benchmark stock assessment through the CDAR process looked at data through 2011. So that's the most current information that we have in terms of a peer-reviewed stock assessment. While it indicates that the stock is not overfished and overfishing is not occurring, we are seeing a fairly consistent trend in declining biomass. That was a concern raised by the plan development team, and the time between the benchmark, the past benchmark assessment in 2011 and the possibly proposed stock assessment that will be available for management purposes probably in 18, 19, maybe even 2020. The council has sort of modified a little bit their methodology for developing stock assessments, and it makes a lot of sense. If you think about it in terms of a research, they're looking at a research track stock assessment that's scheduled for 2018, 2019. What they're trying to do there is to try to keep all the information together and continue to look at these stocks, but not have those stock assessments result in any management action or management recommendations from the panel. But then what they would do is over time they would maintain these research stock assessments for all the stocks, and then on occasion, and in this case in 2019, 2020, do what they call an operational stock assessment, which would actually result in management advice coming out of the CDAR process and out of the South Atlantic Council. So that's generally the timeline that we have for stock status and for the stock assessments coming up. There will be some questions and concerns raised by the PDT at the end of this presentation. One of the big issues that continues to, in fact, I got 2 emails this morning from public regarding the stock boundaries. Those boundaries were established through the South Atlantic Council's Amendment 20B in March of 2015. Atlantic migratory cobia annual catch limits apply from Georgia, the Georgia-Florida line, through New York. Cobia caught off the east coast of Florida are counted against the Florida east coast allocation of the Gulf of Mexico cobia annual catch limit. There is a proposal to include cobia in the stock ID workshop in 2017. That was done during a CDAR discussion at the South Atlantic, where they were looking at stock ID workshops, and with the interest of cobia, it was kind of thrown into the mix. So it was thrown in with multiple other species for stock ID work. There is some concern raised by some of the principal stock ID folks, primarily in South Carolina, that it's possible that a lot of the data that they're working on right now, along with the collaborative and cooperative work being done with other states, may not actually be ready in 2017. So there's some discussion there from the PDT that I'll review later. Going back to the stock boundaries section real quickly, I will say that from talking with Dr. Denson, who was on the plan development team, he had a large hand in developing the genetic information in your public information document. There's some really good data there, and a lot of collaborative, cooperative work done with some of the other states. But they're still trying to process additional samples around that mixing zone, which tends to be that border between Florida and Georgia. And so it's not a knife edge distinction, north of which is all Atlantic migratory group, south of which is Gulf. There's some fuzz there that you have to keep in mind. And the work being done by South Carolina in collaboration with other states will hopefully narrow the information on exactly where that line needs to be. But it may behoove the Commission at some point in time to actually ask Dr. Denson to come and give the presentation that he gave to the South Atlantic Council in Myrtle Beach. Was an outstanding presentation on the analysis that he and others have done on the cobia genetic boundary. It answers a lot of questions. The next slide with Framework Action 4, proposed measures. These were developed at the Myrtle Beach meeting in South Carolina. There was a lot of discussion over various options and issues, and what was submitted to the Secretary through the Council were the following measures: to reduce the recreational bag limit from 2 fish down to 1 fish, to increase the minimum size limit from 33 inches to 36 inches fork length, and to limit commercial harvest to 2 fish per person or 6 per vessel, whichever is more restrictive. And so that is in, as far as I know, that is now either out of the regional office to the Secretary or in the regional office still being reviewed. The expectation, the hope is that those measures would be in place to curb harvest in 2017. recognizing that the Commission would be unlikely to implement anything to curb harvest for this upcoming spring season, which primarily operates from May and through July, August. Just to give you a quick short-term timeline on where we are, today we're discussing the PID for your review, approval, and any edits or comments that you would like to include. Between now and January, it would be my hope to conduct public meetings for those states that request those meetings and accept public comment, and then have those public comment summaries and the comment available for board review and direction for FMP development at the February 2017 meeting in the DC area. So with that, moving into the management issues for the public information document, we discussed with the plan development team the following management issues and questions for your consideration, and I'll go through those one at a time. Management issue 1, one of the overarching questions relates to complementary management with the council. Complementary management of cobia is intended to increase our flexibility and management reaction time at the state level, while providing us the ability to more actively and adequately manage the fishery in your respective states. So some of the questions that we propose putting out for public comment and review are: should the Commission develop a complementary cobia FMP, a plan complementary to the South Atlantic Council's Coastal Migratory Pelagics Fishery Management Plan? What federal measures that are in place or currently proposed should be required, if any, in the Commission plan? What states should be included in the management unit? Again, the genetic analysis that's been done, at least to this point, suggests, and the Council has concurred, that the most appropriate boundary for cobia in our region is the Atlantic Migratory Group from the Georgia-Florida line through New York. I will make one note here that in the documents you will see Rhode Island included in some of the landings information. I didn't exactly know how to handle that. It was 200 or 300 pounds every couple of years. So instead of involving the New England Council and complicating that too much, I simply note, I realize they're not in the Mid-Atlantic Council, but there are a few landings that occur in Rhode Island. And then given the upcoming genetic workshop that is proposed for 2017 at this time, should the Commission plan provide the flexibility to make changes to management and stock units to reflect changes in the science? So what I mean by that is that if the information that's coming out of the genetics labs and the work that's being done suggests that perhaps there's a better line that may be down into the state of Florida, like some of the mackerel and boundaries that occur off of Florida, would we want to be able to have the flexibility to modify our plan to coordinate and complement that new work? The second issue is to provide our intent and purpose is to provide a management plan that achieves the long-term sustainability of the resource and tries to implement and maintain consistent coast-wide measures while allowing our states the flexibility to implement the alternate strategies to accomplish the objectives of the plan. Clearly, we want to provide for sustainable recreational and commercial fisheries, maximum cost effectiveness of current information gathering, and prioritize state obligations to minimize costs of monitoring and management. This was an issue that was raised by the plan development team, and some concerns over the cost and expense of collecting data on a fish that moves so much. It may be that current data collection programs are about as good as we'll have at the present time, unless money is afforded to collect more data. And adopt a long-term management regime which minimizes or eliminates the need to make annual changes or modifications to management measures. This is a very important for-hire fishery, and folks are setting up trips and the like for the following year in many cases, and so changes in the quotas and changes in the potential seasonality can have significant trickle-down impacts to the fishery. So the question for the public is what should be the objectives in managing the cobia fisheries through the Commission, and there may be others that the public would like to weigh in on. Management issue 3, coastwide, regional, or state-by-state management. issues. Many of the states currently manage their cobia fisheries independently. We're considering coordinating that management in order to avoid states being disadvantaged based on where they occur along the migratory route, while maintaining harvest at the Council's ACL level. Just using one example with spiny dogfish, when the fishery would start up in the northeast and move south, oftentimes there weren't a lot of fish left over by the time the seasons got to Virginia and North Carolina. And so the Commission decided to move forward with a plan that would try to mitigate some of those disadvantages by geography of losing out on those fish towards the tail end of the season. This is sort of a reverse of that, where the fishery generally starts to our south and ends up in the northern extreme. So without some controls early in the season, it's probable that some of these quotas may be taken prior to peak fisheries or primary fishing opportunities in the more northern extreme. So questions that the PDT worked on and developed for this section would be that, are consistent state-specific management measures coordinated by the Commission needed for cobia? Are there regional differences in the fishery and/or resource that need to be considered when implementing management measures? Should the plan require a coast-wide closure if the Council quota is met or ACL is met? Should the FMP require coast-wide measures, for example, size and bag limits being consistent throughout the region? Should the FMP require regional measures? And should the plan develop a suite of options for the allocation of state-specific quotas and allow states to adopt unique size, bag, and season measures? So one example of a point that I would bring up that's in your public information document is the work that was analyzed and put together for us by Ryan Jorley from Virginia on the plan development team that showed there is a lot of variability in the stock fishery occurring in federal and state waters. And it varies from almost no fish taken in state waters to 100% as you move north. So there's a lot of variability in the fishery and how it operates from Florida to the states north of Virginia. And so those may need to be taken into account as we move forward with the plan. The management issue 4, commercial and recreational management tools. This is where we hope to get some information on the potential tools that could be used to manage cobia. What are the appropriate commercial and recreational measures for cobia is one question we would ask. Should the plan consider gear restrictions? For example, circle hooks with live and dead bait fisheries for cobia, or the prohibition on gaffing cobia. Those are being used in certain regions and locations. The effectiveness we're not totally certain of at this particular point, but with an increase in size limit from 33 to 36 inches, that's likely going to be a more difficult fish to handle. And unless you net those fish, one of the only ways to get them in the boat to measure them would be to gaff them. So consideration of some of the measures that have been considered in other states to require netting of those fish as opposed to gaffing is something we'd like to receive some public information on. And then, are there other management options that should be considered? For example, slot limits, spawning season closures, et cetera. And should the plan consider some level of de minimis or threshold landings where cobia harvest is minimal or episodic, which tends to be in those states north of Virginia? And then finally, we would ask the public to comment on any other issues for consideration in the development of the Commission's draft FMP for cobia. So those are the general management issues and strategies and questions that we wanted to put out to the public between now and the February meeting. Real quickly, and there may be the expertise around the table and certainly up at the head of the table to discuss a couple of the issues that were raised by the PDT that I think are germane and important for your discussion here today. First, there was concern raised by the plan development team membership on delay in the stock assessment. There's a lot of concern, recognizing that the CDAR process is lengthy and has got a lot of irons in the fire for many species that a lot of people deem very important. There was concern raised over the fact that we are dealing with a terminal year in the assessment of 2011. So we're looking at a stock at this present time where there seems to be a decline in absolute biomass spawning stock, concerns being raised about the harvest, and we're looking at probably about a 10-year period and at least another several years before we have the semblance of a new peer-reviewed stock assessment. So that was one concern raised by the plan development team that I'm really not sure how we address. The second issue that I wanted to bring up, and this was a discussion that was also had by the plan development team, is the stock ID workshop timing. And I believe I completely and fully understand the reason why COBIA were included in the stock ID workshop and think that was a good move. The question is will the information from the primary data collector, which is Dr. Denson in South Carolina, will that be available either early or late in 2017? It does not appear that that may be the case. So what type of information may be gleaned from an upcoming stock ID workshop in 2017 is, for the most part, unknown at this particular time. So those were the two primary issues brought up by the plan development team as we moved forward. Those are not issues that have to be resolved, I don't believe, here today. The main question is, do we have the management issues accounted for in the document, and are you comfortable moving this forward for public comment? So with that, I will stop and try to address any questions that the board may have related to the PID or COBIA in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel. Let's do it maybe to be efficient. Let's do this questions first, and then I would like to hear a short discussion about the questions that Lewis brought up, and then we can talk about what we want to do with the PID. So first off is our questions. Wilson.
Well, not a question, Mr. Chairman. Are you looking for editorial suggestions now as well?
Yeah, I'd like to hold that off, and let's exhaust the questions first, and then we can do that if that's okay. Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Lewis, and I appreciate all the work done. You guys had a great team with the PDT, and it was good work, and really also a lot of good questions, I think, that came out of what we have here. So as far as the questions, I am curious if the Science Center feels that a slight delay is possible in the workshop. Question number one. Question two would be, and forgive me because I'm not that familiar with the new terms, so it wouldn't be an update, it would be a research assessment. Is that right? Is that the new term? We said it wouldn't be used for management, but if it was done and it showed overfishing, would there be a need to take some action, or do we still wait for, I'm going to use the other term, benchmark, which is no longer a benchmark. So those are two questions I have.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And I'm gonna ask John Carmichael to address the majority of those comments. I did fail to mention one thing that I would like to go ahead and get on the record. Dr. Michelle Duvall is oftentimes a member of this board and is the chairman of the South Atlantic Council. I did want to bring up three points that she made, since she wasn't going to be able to be here, for your consideration, and this may address some of the questions. First off, the allocations of the commercial and recreational fishery of 92% recreational and 8% commercial actually began and started in January of 2012, not 2016, as is reported in the PID. And then there were some. She also brought up these similar issues about the stock ID workshop being actually late 2017 as opposed to early. I'm not sure that matters for Dr. Denson's concerns. And then the other point she made was the issue on the research versus the operational track assessments. And that's certainly something that I think is new lexicon for this board. And so hopefully that'll be something that John can also review and have some discussion on in his comments. So, yep.
I have an additional question for the assessment timing. Can you also explain in your in your answer how the South Atlantic Council, or CDAR, or the Southeast Regional Office, has been talking about how the new MRIP information would be incorporated into the assessment timing, since currently as it stands, the MRIP information should be out in 2018, and since this is a species that is quota managed, how that new data coming out would impact the ACL, or how we manage against the ACL.
I guess I'll start with the easy one first, which is probably the MRIP question. So with the timing of this assessment, the recalibrated MRIP information for the new survey should be available, and the intent in the assessment is to use that information directly and not have to do anything more after that. So that's the plan, certainly, and whatever that does to the estimates is what impact it'll have on ACLs and allocations and everything else that comes with it. The other issue is the stock ID workshop. So this is somewhat new territory for us within CDAR. The attention that stock ID is getting, it's somewhat driven by the issues we've dealt with lately on blue line tilefish, and also by the realization from cobia, from hogfish, from a number of recent assessments looking at the stock ID information and realizing that these stocks can be more complicated than perhaps was assumed in the past. And also realizing that one of the important things when you're dealing with that is to make sure that everybody who is going to have a management role within that stock has an opportunity to be at the table when the assessment is done. And this was one of the issues with the previous assessment of blue line, where it was done, the stock was extended up into the area of the Mid-Atlantic jurisdiction, and folks from the Mid-Atlantic weren't really involved in that assessment along the way, and that created some issues. So what we're trying to do is make sure we find out where these mismatches occur between management jurisdictions and stock biological definitions early enough in the process that everyone who needs a seat at the table during the assessment is given a seat at the table, and everyone who needs to make sure that their management needs are going to be met by the products from the assessment have an opportunity to comment on things like the terms of reference for that assessment. So we're working on that now with Blue Line, and that led to us to have this realization that we needed to have this stock ID workshop. And then that has grown as we've seen how important it is to have that and get all these various people at the table. So this workshop was planned to do a number of species. And one of the keys for doing not single species approaches, but several species approaches, is it lets you to get more bang for your buck in terms of bringing in people who are experts in the various pieces of data that contribute to your understanding of stock ID. You know, I think all you guys probably realize that genetics data can be quite controversial, and genetics experts can vary widely in their interpretation of that data. We've certainly seen that with cobia and with pretty much every stock we've looked at. So one of the keys to that seems to be to bring in as many genetics experts as you can. And to get that critical mass, it can help to have multiple species that you're working with in doing that. You know, and Blue Line, again, was an example. We had a dedicated stock workshop, and it was very hard to get the competing genetics experts in that place at that time and be devoted to that topic. So one of the really bang for the buck we're hoping for in the multiple species is to try and overcome that problem. So that put us in this having this multiple species approach, and that somewhat drives the timing of the workshop. Another thing that's affected the timing of the workshop is, of course, the many other things that are going on with CDAR and balancing the data deliverables and other things between this workshop and other assessments that we have going on. And that left us really two windows to do this, which was going to be sometime in fall 2017, sometime in July 2017. And when we discussed this at the steering committee, because of a lot of the concerns with what we've experienced so far in stock ID, the recommendation was that whatever comes out of this workshop should go through some type of peer review. So we're looking forward to convening something with our SSC representatives and CIE representatives, Center for Independent Experts, that would review that information. Because we're finding that, you know, if a council is brought into an assessment and their technical folks, their SSC, or in your case, your technical committee folks weren't involved in that, well, then that doesn't really build support. That causes a lot of doubt. And when you get in situations where they say, well, we're not sure we're going to go along with the recommendation of that group of experts because none of our experts were part of that group. So that led the steering committee to say what we really need to have then is this peer review, so that when we go into this assessment, we know what the stock boundaries are, and we have pretty good confidence in the overlap in those. Because if not, what happens is we get in situations like we did with Blue Line and others where you make, or even Cobia, where you make that recommendation early in the data workshop process, it goes through the peer review in the very end, and even if they accept it, people suddenly start having issues with it and questioning things that were done. So we've decided that it's really critical to have that decision made up front. Have it go through an independent peer review so that you can then go into the assessment with confidence. And it seems like a lot to do, something that 20 years ago in assessments we didn't hardly give a second thought to. But the reality is this stock ID is absolutely critical to everything that comes afterward in the assessment. You know, models today are complicated. Catch is modeled, indices are modeled, selectivity is modeled, catchability is modeled, and all of that's modeled on a stock-by-stock basis. All the data needs to be parsed out according to the stocks. So we experienced with the first Cobia assessment delays because the stock ID changed along the way, and all the data that were put together in one set of bins had to be put together in another set of bins. And in fact, they wanted to explore a couple set of bins, which was a huge demand on our data people. So because of all that, the data people are the ones who've kind of demanded, you got to settle stock ID up front. So again, something that's been relatively simple in the past is now incredibly complicated. And that's affected the timing. So we're trying to get this early so we can have this peer review. Now that brings me to Cobia. So it's just come to my attention, certainly here, that there may be some concerns with data being collected in South Carolina that aren't going to be ready for a workshop that looks now is going to be held in July. And just by way of timing, the weeks were only picked about, 12 days ago. There was a meeting of the folks organizing this workshop that happened after the steering committee approved it happening. So we're early in the planning stages for this, and not everyone who's going to be participating has been reached out to. They're just working on the list of key folks now based on the stocks. And later this week and next week, Julia Bird, who's the planning coordinator for all of this and making all this happen, is going to be reaching out to key people and try to find out which dates work, and certainly at that time try to find out where things stand on data. So if we get in a situation where the Cobia information is not going to be ready for the timing of this workshop, then I think we have to consider, you know, perhaps doing Cobia on a standalone or through some other way that we can make sure that that information is available, because we certainly don't want to do this and know that there's going to be new information available, you know, 6 months or a year down the road. Now that could affect the overall timing of the Cobia assessment. I don't know. I mean, that would really come down to when it's going to be done and when the data is available. And so I guess I'll pause here because I feel like I've been talking a long time, see if there's any other questions about the stock ID. And if we get through that, then I will talk about the research track and the timing of the Cobia assessment.
Following up on the timing for the MRIP data, just to confirm, then will the Southeast Regional Science Center then develop a method to back calculate the MRIP data so that what we judge the recreational fishery on in terms of if they achieved or did not achieve the RHL? Because if the new estimates have the potential to be six-fold higher than what we set the ACL based on, because we use the old method data to set what it's based on, then using the new information every year to judge until 2020 when the new assessment comes out. So I assume they would backtrack it?
It's certainly in all my participation with the various transition teams and calibration teams is that the intent is we would have to adjust management parameters to match the new data, or we would have to calibrate the new process to the old data, which develop the management parameters. But everyone involved recognizes that you can't change the survey, thus change your yardstick without changing what you're trying to measure. So which way it goes, I don't think we know at this point, you know, whether we adjust the entire landing streams and then managers make the change to change their ACLs, or we have a calibration of the new MRIP survey that's consistent with the way MRIP is done up to this point. And the latter is probably a little bit cleaner for management's purposes because they're not taking, say, framework actions or what have you to change all of their ACLs. But certainly that has to be done. Everyone knows that you can't evaluate and apply an ACL measurement on a new way of measuring your fishery without updating what it is you're trying to achieve.
Mr. Bush, did you have a question?
Dr. Daniel, thank you for the presentation. Maybe two questions after a brief statement. I'm sure you've probably been beat up with a few emails asking questions about certain aspects of this. one of them being the tagging study from the Chesapeake Bay showing about 80% of the fish supposedly stayed there. When you were looking at biomass, did you include this biomass in that overall reduction or reduction of biomass that you mentioned?
Yeah, you're going to have to repeat the question, David, because I can't. It's hard. I'm having a hard time hearing you back there.
Sorry, I'll move up here a little closer. So, again, thank you for your presentation. The question I had is that the VIM study that was done out in the Chesapeake Bay showing approximately 80% of the tagged fish stayed there. Now, that particular biomass, since you don't really have the stock IDs pinned down at this point, I know it's sort of a crystal ball-ish kind of question, but was that biomass taken into consideration when you were looking at an overall decrease in the biomass?
I'm not exactly certain if that information specifically was used in the biomass calculations. I would tend to doubt that it was. But the issue really with if you look and see, if you see the presentation that was done by Dr. Denson, he does bring up these specific distinct population segments, of which Chesapeake Bay actually is a distinct, he believes is a distinct population segment, along with a distinct population segment in the southern part of South Carolina. And South Carolina actually has moved forward with some management measures to protect those fish in the southern portion of South Carolina DPS. I don't know that anything yet has been done with the Virginia portion. I think, again, that any of the information related to the tagging data, the length of time that the tags were at large, certainly those fish are moving inshore and offshore, north and south. And so it would be very difficult, I think, with the information that's available to date, to be able to make any specific recommendations in terms of biomass trends based on those movements that really are rudimentary at this point. I think, but as Dr. Denson begins to collect more samples and collects more information, which I know he's working with Virginia, specifically North Carolina, and other states to collect that data, hopefully a pattern there will arise. But at the present time, as John indicated, the complexity of the genetic IDs and trying to parse out the various genetic components of these stocks is extraordinarily difficult and complicated. And until that information is lock solid, I don't believe it would be used to manipulate or modify the way that the general stock assessment has been completed to this time.
Sure. My second question is sort of more for my own edification. When the ACLs were set, and then the couple of northern states that were added to that list, the allocation was set kind of without those states being involved, if I understand correctly. Do we anticipate that possibly being readjusted at some point?
Well, I think the ACL is based on the stock assessment and what number comes out to. For cobia's position, we're not overfished and overfishing is not occurring. The current ACL has been set as a precautionary measure to avoid overfished and overfishing occurring, which kicks in a whole new set of Council and National Marine Fisheries Service protocol and requirements for the plan. And so at the present time, the ACL is set at a level that's precautionary to avoid those problems from occurring. I don't believe that the distribution of the catches really play a role in the ACL at all. It's a specific number. Where you run into an issue there potentially is with the allocation and the current 92.8, whether or not that takes into account any of the issues that are going on, say, north of Virginia. I would be doubtful that it would have much of an effect because of the extraordinarily low landings that are measured north of Virginia. I think once you get up there, I'd be speculating at the percentage, but it's an extraordinarily low percentage that I doubt would have much of an impact on either the ACL or the allocation distribution. But certainly it would be I assume that it would be the intent of the Commission, if they move forward with this plan, to provide the opportunity for any state that has an interest in cobia to make sure that their state's interests are reflected in anything that occurs at the Commission level.
Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to follow up on Mr. Busher's question. Perhaps I didn't fully understand it, and I would like John to correct me if I'm wrong, but Virginia participated in the last CDAR. We contributed quite a bit of data. We had some of the best age data on the coast, and in fact, we were responsible for increasing that max age. This was a statistical catch-at-age model, and I think we well represented the catch-at-age for the Chesapeake Bay harvest. So I think as far as the last assessment, that biomass certainly, and that catch is certainly part of that model. So I just wanted to point that out.
Are there any other? Adam.
Thank you very much. So one item that I don't see in the document right now, and I'm curious if there was discussion at the PDT level. The reason we're really here is a function of what the recreational catch estimates have been in recent years. And what we've learned, despite the many improvements with the MRIP program, is that individual intercepts can drive these numbers by a factor of literally hundreds of thousands, individual intercepts. And when you're talking about the very low rate of intercept, that has huge implications. Now, I'm not familiar with how the South Atlantic has dealt with these recreational issues in the past. I know at the Mid-Atlantic, 2 of the FMPs we deal with, one for summer flounder, black sea bass scup, looks at the catch on an annual basis, compares it to the last year, and then changes the regulations accordingly. The Bluefish plan, however, does it differently, allowing for an averaging of recent years' harvest. So my question right now is, did the PDT have discussion about these different methods for using the recreational catch data, and what options, if they did have that discussion, did they consider putting in the document for comment on the public on how best to try to mitigate these impacts that the MRIP data is having?
Very good question, and I'll make an effort, and then if others want to step in, I guess, Mr. Chairman, that would be okay. There was discussion at the PDT level on the landings, primarily because I messed them up in the document when I was initially putting them together. I was comparing apples and oranges using some of the MRIP data and some of the Southeast Fisheries Science Service data, and so we decided to go with the Southeast Fisheries Science Service data because that was what was being used to manage the quota, and that that information had remained relatively stable over time. Now the PDT is not making a determination as to which one is better or not. It's just simply that was the number that was consistent. It was the number that was used to close the fishery in 2016, and so that was the number that we were consistent with. And I think that's the key, is being consistent in the methodology that you use. My understanding, and there's folks in this room that know a lot more about the MRIP specifics than I do, but one of the things that occurs is that there are adjustments made to MRIP over time, and that those numbers can fluctuate. And so when you go to look at the landings data, they may be 1.5 million one day and 1.7 million, after some time. And so it does make it a little more difficult. So I think, as John indicated, the intent and purpose is to try to get the MRIP data, which we've all bought into and agreed to, as the primary methodology that's used for managing and for accounting for the harvest of recreationally caught cobia. So I think our concern at the present time, not being able to, concentrating on cobia and not delving into the specifics of the Southeast Center's data collection programs and the MRIP collection programs, was to be consistent, at least in what we presented to the board. So in terms of any kind of proposal of any kind of increases, I mean, there have been efforts and attempts to incorporate for-hire logbooks and trying to collect information on the for-hire sector that has not gone well, dealing with the for-hire folks, at least in certain regions. How to improve that data collection program on what tends to be a fairly rare species. There's information coming out right now about some of the PSEs, at least in the Virginia and the North Carolina estimates for this year, that have raised some concerns. And I'm not sure that anyone, and I certainly don't have the answer to those questions at this specific moment, but they are definitely issues that I'm certain will be raised throughout the public comment period and into the next several iterations of the FMP if we move forward with one. Not a whole lot, but to just explain that there are a lot of issues, and I concur with your concern.
Adam, I think what you're asking in addition is, can we add a question or two in the PID document about how we address harvest for recreational landings, and can we do averaging, can we not do averaging of that landings information, and how do we use those data, whether it be to determine whether or not we've hit the RHL or not with averaging data, or do we only use averaging data or some other format of the information to help set the measures? And we can add that question to issue 4. What Lewis did just bring up, though, is a question for this management board. Is typically when the commission pulls data for the recreational fishery, we use MRIP data from the document, or 4 documents that we manage. The South Atlantic Council does not use MRIP data. They use the information that comes out of the Southeast Fisheries Science Center. I don't know, and this is a question to John, does the Southeast Fisheries Science Center go outside of the southern states for the landings? So for example, as Lewis said, Rhode Island has landings of cobia. They're very small, but it's still something that we should be including in our management document. It's not there right now. And so if it's not done by the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, then the board needs to decide how we want to move forward, because we will have to consider what data we use. If you decide, say you decide you want to do allocations, we have to know what set of data to use to do those allocations.
Sure, and the South Atlantic is a lot like the Mid-Atlantic, it sounds. We have some that use averages and some that use annual years. For your first question, cobia is one that was set up with averages, but the 3-year moving average, but the clock restarts when there's a change in the ACL. So that's the situation we were in. The ACL had changed, and that's why the moving average couldn't be used. But it's certainly something that can be considered. And as far as the MRIP, it is correct. The Southeast Center does some additional post-processing of the MRIP data. And they use the core estimates that are available from MRIP, and their processing addresses the weight estimates from MRIP. I think any of y'all have looked at an MRIP query, you know it warns you weight data is measured with great uncertainty and is not as reliable as the estimates of the numbers of fish go up, because that's what they ask people about, numbers, and they measure fewer fish, you know, than what they actually see. So there's always great uncertainty in the poundage that's associated with any of those MRIP estimates. So that's really a problem for many of the South Atlantic species. We manage many species. Some of them are very rare in the recreational database. And so what the center has done is come up with a way to do a different sampling approach to try to fill in missing values, or when there maybe is only one fish measured for a wave mode, what have you, combination, perhaps within a year. And so they borrow from adjacent cells, essentially, and they try to come up with a better estimate of what the actual average weight is for a given fish within a given component of MRIP. And how much of that borrowing they do obviously depends on how good the sampling is. For some species, it's very little, and their estimates will pretty well match, most times exactly, what you see if you take an MRIP query and then you look at something put out by the Southeast Center for the actual poundage that is landed. That's assuming, of course, you're only looking at the private and charter boats, because you can't forget also, within the Southeast, we have a separate survey that does the head boat. So if you were to do an MRIP query and look at landings of recreational in the Southeast and compare it to something from the center that included the estimates from the Southeast Headboat Survey, the two are not going to match, and they're never going to match, because that component is not in the MRIP query database. So we have two things that are at work here within the Southeast. One is the Headboat Survey that has to be accounted for, so you're not going to get the MRIP exact, and the other is the alternative approach for dealing with the weights. And then if we, you know, the Southeast also includes the Gulf, so if we have species that, depending on how they wrap around the South Atlantic and Gulf jurisdictions and what you're doing with Monroe County down in the Florida Keys, that can lead to other post-processing things that are done to get the data to match the actual stock or the management unit, which may not make them match within the overall MRIP queries that you do. So, you know, MRIP within the Southeast is a much more complicated beast than it is with the guys, say, in the Mid-Atlantic and New England, and we're kind of jealous of that at times because we have so many other things that are in play. It makes it very hard to just do a simple query and get the information. But in general, they rely on the estimates, but there's things that have to be done afterwards to make sure they're complete and accurate.
Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Switching topics slightly, I think under issue 3, I just wanted to confirm that there's some room for conversation for the public for issues like the Chesapeake Bay, where we may have access to a smaller fish. So I'm wondering about conservation equivalency. And if the flexibilities that are mentioned under issue 3 cover that, or if we need to have more specific language for the public to comment on something of that nature.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. That was not specifically discussed by the PDT, and in the development of this, I don't recall that being brought up. So I guess it's certainly, if it's something that the board wanted to consider, we could try to. I think that the regional differences bullet, the second bullet, probably addresses that if the board agrees that it addresses that. If not, we could make some slight modifications to the language to make sure that it addressed that if it was the desire of the board. But that was not discussed or considered, but it could be.
So I think if there's not any objection, we'll ask that be clarified in the document.
That's not a problem.
Other questions? Robert. Comment?
I was wondering, Mr. Chairman, if you were ready for a motion.
Yeah, but do we want to first discuss the type of data that we want to use to estimate harvest? Do we want to do that here? Madam.
So I appreciate the responses I received to my question, and while Tony might have most directly answered it, the information from Lewis and John were extremely helpful in building on that. And based on those complexities, it gives me pause and to think that those issues should actually be described for the public. And that should be an issue that we go out to the public and get some more information on. So I would recommend, I appreciate the suggestion of adding one bullet point under recreational management tools, but from what I've heard, I think the whole issue of recreational deserves its own issue, quite frankly. There's just so many questions about the data, how it's used, what should be used, what to use to calculate the RHL for a comparison basis, whether to trigger ACLs, and I think I've just touched the tip of the iceberg, not to take away from Dr. Stenick's presentation yesterday. I think it's an entire issue unto itself, and I would encourage consideration by this board of requesting that recreational be broken out as a separate issue, and a number of these topics that have been discussed recently be described to the public and asked for comment on.
Adam, we can definitely separate the two issues. I just am curious, what kind of feedback would we be looking for in terms of asking the public whether or not we should use the Southeast regional data versus the MRIP data? Do you think that the complexity of the issue is a decision that you all should decide? What would you be seeking us to find from the public on them? Or is that something that the board can answer for us today?
Well, I'd like to believe that the fishermen would have some input, as a collaborative basis with regards to their thoughts about what the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of each of those data sets are. And getting that feedback could potentially help inform us with the decision. Moreover, I'd like to hear the thoughts about ways to help mitigate those impacts. These impacts, I mean, we're talking directly about cobia, but the impacts of that harvest data go way beyond cobia. And any and all opportunities that we have to get some more information about how to mitigate the extreme impacts of the limitations of the data, I think we would be remiss if we didn't take advantage of that opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along those lines, and to keep the conversation moving along, it strikes me that if the Commission customarily addresses these questions by using the MRIP data, then I, for one, would be in favor of being consistent in using the MRIP data in compiling the information for the PID. Thank you.
And I'm not, and I obviously will do whatever the board recommends. Is cobia the place to have this huge debate and deliberation? I'm asking the question. This is a major issue for the Commission if we're going to move into this discussion as to what's better, Southeast data or MRIP data. Again, I will restate that the PDT, as long as we were consistent in using the various technologies and methods that we have available, was that appropriate. What the impacts are to an individual state or an individual fisherman, I mean, we don't have, I don't think we know the answer to that question at this time. So in a fishery where there tends to be less interest north of Virginia, I don't want to say any more than that about it. This is a coast-wide issue that we're delving into here with cobia that may not be the most appropriate place to address this question. Just a comment.
Robert, follow up.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to follow Dr. Daniels' comments with something he said earlier. For the boards, I think it's helpful for us to take a deep breath and remember why we're here. The latest stock assessment under which we're operating for cobia suggests we're not overfishing and the stock is not overfished. In 2015, we blew the ACL by 2.5 times. So the purpose, I believe, one of the purposes here is to get us all on the same page to help us manage and sustain and conserve this fishery, so that the next stock assessment will also reveal that we're not overfishing and the stock is not overfished. And Dr. Daniel, I appreciate your comments. The point about the data and the veracity of the data, the representativeness of the data, is in my estimation, in my opinion, is a discussion for a much broader audience. And the cobia anglers that I know, not only in my state but elsewhere, I don't think are going to be well served by that conversation. I struggle with understanding sometimes the distinction between Southeast Fisheries Science Center produced data, catch estimates, and MRIP. So it's a difficult concept for me to grasp. I'm not sure that it's really necessary to go to the public with an inside baseball question. And so I just would, again, encourage the board to remember the purpose here. I believe when the policy board said, yes, let's develop an interstate fishery management plan, is to let's see if we can develop a framework under which and by which we may work together to sustain this resource in conjunction with the council in a complementary fashion, so that we do not end up with this fishery overfished and overfishing. Thanks.
Dr. Crabtree.
Yeah, I agree with some of the comments Robert made. You know, the way that the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, I think, re-stratifies and re-weights some of the weights and things is done across all of the species that we're tracking now. in the southeast. And so if we were going to make a change in how we do that, I think we would have to apply it across all of these species to be consistent. But at this point, I mean, the Science Center is advising us that the restratification, the way they're doing it, produces the most reliable and the best estimates. So that's what we're going to have to use to track ACLs at the federal level, at least, until something changes with that. And I'm not sure that going out to the public on a question like that is really going to be productive, because I think it largely gets into a highly technical statistical discussions about how to deal with what I think, as John said, is principally the weights that are used. And I don't even understand exactly how they do that myself, and I'm not sure we're going to get a lot of good input from the public on that. So I think that is a larger question. And as Robert pointed out, we did have a substantial ACL overrun in 2015. We have the preliminary catch estimates for 2016 through wave 4, and it appears to me that the catches in 16 may be as high ultimately at the end of the year as they were in 15, because I'm seeing that the preliminary estimate is something on the order of 1.2 million pounds was caught at the end of August. And again, that's off the MRIP site, so there'll be changes to that. And as John pointed out, that doesn't include the headboat survey, so there are more catches that will be added into that. But it does, based on everything we know, look like that we're fishing this stock at a level that is not sustainable. And even with all of the uncertainties about the catches, the differences are so great that it's hard to ignore it. So I think we do have a real problem here. I think federal management alone cannot solve this problem. I think even if the EEZ was completely closed year-round, I don't think it would make a great difference in the magnitude of these catches, because most of them seem to be coming out of state waters. So I think that the only way we're going to get these catches to a sustainable level is through a commission management plan. I think there's a lot of room for discussion between the commission and the council as to what, if any, role federal management needs to play in this. But it's clear to me that successful management is going to require an ASMFC plan.
Thank you. John?
I think it would be helpful in the document to clarify the different data sources. You know, and to be clear that it's not an issue of MRIP versus Southeast Center data. They're all MRIP data. The center just has a separate processing step applied to the MRIP data. So it would certainly be helpful to clarify that, to explain why an MRIP query that people can readily access may not be the same as the document. And also because this is probably new to many of the affected fishermen, this idea that there's this separate monitoring of the headboat through the Southeast Region Headboat Survey. And, you know, folks are accustomed to being able to go to MRIP and see the entire recreational landings in one-stop shopping. They're not going to get that in this. And I think it'd be very important for the document to at least acknowledge that there are separate estimates brought in from the headboat survey, and they're not available over the MRIP system. I think we'd all love one day if you could get all of that information in one place consistently, but until that time, you know, it would help to clarify what the different sources are, so that people that aren't accustomed to this aren't then coming back to you and saying, look, you don't even have the landings right. And we do this a lot just because we do face that quite often when people go to the readily accessible sites and get information and it doesn't match what's in assessments or management plans or what have you. It's important to explain it to them.
Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it seems like we have gotten into comments a little bit, and I did have one editorial concern. I think if you look at page 2 of the document, it states that there was a closure, you know, during 2016, and it did have an economic impact, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you go to page 3, it clearly states that North Carolina and Virginia came up with alternative measures, so they didn't have to close. So I just think there needs to be some clarity in the document that states up front somewhere that there was a closure in federal waters, but that there wasn't a closure in state waters. And we just heard Dr. Crabtree share the preliminary results for 2016. So my concern is over how we say, or what adjectives we use, I guess, relative to economic impact. Clearly, if a closure is put in place in federal waters, then that has some level of impact. But if you continue fishing in state waters in North Carolina and Virginia, what's the real magnitude of the economic impact? If we have data that we could cite, about numbers of trips declining or numbers of clients who cancel trips or things like that, it would be good if we could share that information. But I do think we need to state up front, as opposed to reading something on page 1 that implies there was a closure, and then page 2 says, well, yeah, but it didn't apply in North Carolina and Virginia state waters. I think we just need to fix that. It's just an editorial thing. Oh, and then I did want to compliment the PDT and Lewis. I think they did a great job putting the PID together, and I'm especially attuned to the genetic information that's in there. Again, I think I said it at our last meeting, and I'll say it at this one. I think we as a commission have a responsibility not only to look at things like age structure and SSB and distribution of fishes, but also the genetic health of the stock. And in those cases where you have stocks that are homing, and that was clearly pointed out in the PID, there are aggregations of fish that are spawning in different geographic areas that we need to be concerned about. And I'm really waiting to see that outcome of the genetic work that helps us to further differentiate where there are actually different spawning stocks. And I have this fear of, well, not a fear, but a desire to avoid ending up where things wound up in some parts of the Northeast where you had a whole lot of local cod stocks that were spawning locally that didn't get recognized until after they'd already been fished out. So hopefully we can avoid any sort of scenario like that.
Thank you, Wilson, and I think we will clarify that issue. Are there any objections to, in the document, regarding the sources of data, identifying the sources of data, and to be consistent, use the data that we get from the Southeast Science Center? Is there any objections to doing that? Okay, seeing none, that's what we'll do. Do we have more questions? Excuse me.
Just a comment, and that's what I have on my list at this particular point in time, just so everybody's clear, a distinction between using the Southeast data, but also distinguishing between the Southeast Science Center information and the MRIP data, so that that's clear. Particularly bringing up the point that John raised about the for-hire or the headboat survey information, sorry. And then addressing Wilson's point on the implication that it was closed when it was really maintained openness in Virginia and North Carolina after the closure. Those are the corrections that I have for the public draft at this time.
We got Lynn and then Joe.
Thank you, and I think this goes into the editorial category, but it links with what Wilson was saying. It might be helpful for the public under issue 1 to be a bit more descriptive about what exactly a complementary management plan means. In the white paper that we went through in August, there's a really nice description of the different ways you can manage, whether it be joint or complementary or ASMFC specific. And I feel like it's not particularly clear what we're buying when we do a complementary plan. So I think some clarification there, and I think it speaks to what Wilson was saying as well. When the states are open but the feds are closed, what exactly are we doing here? Thanks.
Good point. We will add that in there. Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate the order you chose, because this will be a follow-up to Lynn's question then. When this board voted on implementing this public information document to go down this road, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Duvall's motion specifically stated that this would be complementary management. And I believe the policy board also voted on going towards complementary management. So I'm curious, since that's the first question, is should this be complementary management? Is this being revisited, and would the board be revoting on whether or not that's the path we're taking?
I'll be honest, I wasn't altogether clear on what action the board was specifically taking there, and felt that because of some of the comments that we had received, that may be something that you would want to have some public comment on. It's certainly, if the board has decided that it will be complementary management with the South Atlantic, we can make some modifications to the document to reflect that. So I appreciate those comments. It's likewise, it's a similar issue with the management unit. The council has made the decision, and the genetics data seem to confirm that Georgia-Florida line to New York is AMG, Atlantic Migratory Group cobia. But we are going to provide the opportunity to the public to make some comments on that. Whether it's contrary or consistent with the data or not is a tough one. So I would be standing by for any suggestions on how to address that, contrary to the way the document lays it out at this time.
Joe, the only other thing that I would add is we could make it clear in the document that it's the intention of the South Atlantic Board to do complementary management. Does the public have a differing opinion? Because you do have the ability, since it's not a final decision until you approve the FMP, you can alter from your initial initiation of the plan.
That works for me. Thank you.
Are there any more comments before I go to Robert, because I think he had a motion? Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, a nice shout out to the plan development team. With that and with the discussion around here, the board, I'd make a motion that we approve the draft PID for public comment.
As amended, did I hear you say that?
Yes.
I thought so. Thank you. Have a second? Lynn? Okay, I will read the motion. Oh, no, apparently not yet. Okay. Move to accept the draft cobia FMP public information document for public comment as amended. Motion by Dr. Boyle, seconded by Ms. Fegley. Are there any objections to the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes unanimously. Next item. Next item is the Red Drum Working Group report, and I think that's going to be given by Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. So I'll be reporting on the work and recommendations for the tasks from this board to the Red Drum Technical Committee and Stock Assessment Subcommittee following the presentation of the stock synthesis model estimates. So just a summary of those tasks, looking at the appropriateness of the current biological reference points, looking at F-based reference points for juveniles only, the validity of age-based models for Red Drum given some data limitations in their life history. Also looking at the tag return rates from the stock synthesis models and determining how to treat the tag recapture data within those models. And the final is doing continuity runs of the statistical catch age models using CEDAR 18. So this is just a summary of the meetings that we've had for addressing these tasks, with those highlighted in red occurring since the August meeting when we last updated the board on the progress for these tasks. And so I'll just go ahead and read the tasks as they were given into the record. The first is biological reference points. Investigate whether the current biological reference point for overfishing, 40% SPR target and 30% SPR threshold, is appropriate given the species' long life history. This task is twofold in that the board is interested in whether spawning stock biomass is an appropriate metric and whether the 30% threshold and 40% target are suitable goals. The board also requests the development for an overfished reference point recommendation. Two of the major items that the group looked at to address this task were first, a literature review and discussion amongst the group of the theory and use of these percent SPR reference points relative to red drum life history. And in the document that was provided for meeting materials, there's kind of an annotated bibliography of a lot of the reference that was reviewed by the technical committee relating to SPR reference points. And also some projections under various stock recruit relationships and different percent SPR or escapement trajectories. And this is just an example of what we looked at for the projections, and this actually comes from analysis Mike Murphy did for Gulf of Mexico red drum in Florida. But these figures show two equally or close to equally plausible stock recruit relationships for red drum within the purple lines, and those stock recruit relationships are fit to biomass and recruit estimates out of models. And then also different expected recruitment and spawning stock biomass values from a population given that stock recruit relationship and various fishing levels at different SPR percentages, which are the different dashed line trajectories. And you can see under these two equally plausible stock recruit relationships, you have very different effects on the expected recruitment under those different fishing mortality regimes. And so this is some of the uncertainty that the group looked at when trying to determine if the current target and thresholds are appropriate for red drum. So the recommendation from the technical committee for this task is to maintain the 30% SPR threshold and 40% SPR target for both red drum stocks. They did note that improved information on the stock recruit relationship is necessary before alternative percent SPR levels can be reliably evaluated for management of red drum. An overfish reference point is not recommended without reliable spawning stock biomass estimates. But they did note, since SPR is a recruit-based reference point, it is important to qualitatively consider the recruitment trend from the model estimates with SPR estimates in the absence of these biomass estimates and an overfish status. The SPR doesn't necessarily reflect any potential declines in recruitment, so it's necessary to consider this information with no biomass estimates from the models. The F-based reference point, given concerns regarding the appropriateness of the current reference point and the lack of data on adult red drum, the board would like to see an investigation of the feasibility of an F-based reference point that looks strictly at the harvest of juvenile red drum. The board looks for guidance on whether this type of reference point would provide an appropriate level of information for management. The group started with discussion around advantages and disadvantages of a potential juvenile F-based reference point. Here the advantages are listed. We did note a strong relationship between juvenile fishing mortality estimates and SPR estimates out of the modeling approaches, which hints that you could potentially use a juvenile fishing mortality reference point or juvenile fishing mortality estimates almost as sort of a proxy for SPRs across the entire age structure. There is the potential for improved precision for these estimates since most of the data does come from juvenile fish. And there's also potential for reliable estimates from several different approaches which could be used to validate these alternative approaches. And these figures show the relationship between the SPR estimates on the y-axis and the F estimates on the x-axis from the stock synthesis models for the southern stock on the left and the northern stock on the right. And these are some of the disadvantages that the group considered when looking at this task. One that's a reoccurring issue that's been discussed in past assessments for red drum, mainly around a potential use of escapement as a reference or as a reference point, is the difficulty identifying the appropriate reference point, particularly without information on the stock-recruit relationship and how these different fishing mortality levels on the juvenile stock affect spawning stock biomass and subsequently future recruitment. Another major disadvantage is that this type of a reference point would ignore fishing mortality on mature fish, and the current data does support increasing fishing mortality on mature fish, mostly due to increasing catch and release across the different stocks. And also another disadvantage is the juvenile-based fishing mortality reference point would be independent of recruitment, similar to, as I mentioned, for the SPR reference points. So there is the potential, if spawning stock biomass declines, there could be a decline in recruitment, and even though you're fishing that declined recruitment levels above the threshold or target, that doesn't provide information on that declining recruitment, so that wouldn't necessarily trigger management action by just using that reference point. And this just shows that relationship, that increasing trend of the fishing mortality on the mature fish from the estimates from the stock synthesis models, with the northern stock in the upper left-hand panel and the estimates for the southern stock in the lower right-hand corner. So the recommendation for this reference point, the technical committee concluded that management with a juvenile F-based reference point could lead to stock depletion. This could occur through, as a result of declines in recruitment due to declines in spawning stock biomass and or poor recruitment due to the high variability in recruitment that has been observed in red drum. The technical committee recommends against using a juvenile F-based reference point solely to manage the red drum stocks. The validity of age-based models test. The board is concerned that the lack of information on adult red drum, especially in the northern stock, may impact the ability of the stock synthesis model to accurately measure stock abundance. As a result, the board asks for an evaluation of how red drum life history and current regulations, namely the moratorium on fishing in federal waters, may limit the validity of an age-based model such as SS3. So I'll just highlight here a couple of the main points that the group discussed when discussing this task. The first is a lack of contrast in the data used to inform potential stock productivity in the models. The model time series is short relative to red drum longevity and also the history of the fisheries. The model time series starts in 1989 due to lack of different data types prior to that year. And also the long line indices, which provides information on the adult portion of the stock, show little contrast and again provides little information on the potential productivity of the stocks. All fishery selectivities are dome-shaped due to the regulations and also the life history of red drum as they move offshore and become less vulnerable to fisheries. And this can confound the estimate of selectivity, where you have a descending slope of selectivity for older fish, and the model can struggle to estimate what that descent is due to a decline in mortality and what portion of that descent is due to a decline in reduced availability as those fish move offshore. these 2 points here are of concern. These get more to potential data biases in the data that were used in the models. It was noted that estimated harvest of the adult fish from MRFs back in the late 80s and early 90s is very low in a period when harvest of these adult fish was legal. And the information from tag recapture data conflicts with these estimates, suggesting that a high proportion of adult fish were actually harvested during these same time period. Also, we used volunteer tag recapture length data as a proxy for the size structure of the dead recreational discards and the recreational CPUE, and there are some limitations of using these data based on instructions that were given to recreational anglers on certain sizes that were supposed to be tagged and things like that. So the recommendation for this task is to continue using age-structured models for red drum. The technical committee believes that the differences in red drum life history, characteristics, and vulnerability to fisheries across ages is best modeled with an age-structured model that tracks cohorts through time. However, they do recommend addressing some of the effects that I just went over of data limitations through additional assumptions and reduced model complexity. The next task was to look at the tag return rates. Given the sensitivity of the SS3 models to the tag return reporting rate, the board asks for an evaluation of potential tag return rates for each region and determine if the tag return data should be incorporated into new model runs. The board is specifically interested in a run which uses an 18% tag return rate per the suggestion of the desk review report. And I'll note here that most of this work focused on the northern model due to the inconsistencies between the reporting rates out of that model and the reporting rates in previous literature looking at the tag recovery data. So some of the things that were done to look into this task was a likelihood profile, data weighting sensitivity runs, comparison of external tag recovery model estimates to the estimates from the stock synthesis model, and model runs with simulated recapture data. And for the southern stock model, there were sensitivity runs that we completed looking at some of the fixed reporting rates, specifically that 18% that was requested. So this is a likelihood profile for the northern stock, and on the y-axis has the change in the negative log likelihood relative to the minimum negative log likelihood. And so what this shows is for these lines here, particularly this black line, which is the total negative log likelihood, as that line increases and gets to higher values, it suggests that the parameter values on the x-axis, which are the reporting rate estimates for reporting of tagged red drum, become less likely given the data that are used in the model. So as you increase the reporting rate from 10%, which is at the very far left of the x-axis, up to 95%, the model suggests that those estimates are less likely as you increase given the data that you're using in the model. However, I will note that there does appear to be some conflicts amongst the different data components that make up the total negative log likelihood, and these are the other colored lines here on this figure. If you look at the blue line, that's the length composition data, and that mostly agrees with this increase in the total negative log likelihood, but certain data components like the conditional agent length data, which is the green line, have a different trend and seem to conflict with some of these other data components. And these are some of the estimates from the different runs in the likelihood profiling. On the left are the annual spawning potential ratios, and on the right are the age 0 recruitment estimates. And you don't need to see the specific lines here and what they are, but I will just note that for the lower SPR estimates all bundled up, those are from model runs where the tag reporting rate is fixed at 45% and lower. The one gray line in the middle are the CDAR 18 SPR estimates with the target SPR, the dashed black line. And then the other sort of group of high SPR estimates are from model runs with the reporting rate fixed at 50% and greater. And similar to that for the age 0 recruitment, you can't really see, but there is a line that's much lower. And there's several overlapping lines. Again, those are the estimates from the models with the reporting rate fixed at 45% and lower. The black dashed line are the recruitment estimates from CDAR 18. And then the other group of recruitment estimates bundled together are the recruitment estimates from the models with reporting rate fixed at 50% and higher. And what this shows is that the model's kind of flip-flopping between two drastically different solutions here, which suggests some instability in the model when the tag recapture data are included and the reporting rates are fixed. And this further shows that that instability I just mentioned. On the left, again, our likelihood profile plots. On the left there, these are for the unfished recruitment estimate out of the model. And for the left figure, that is the likelihood profiling with the tag recapture data and the reporting rate fixed at different values. And what this shows is that the value from the base model, which is 5.5 on the lower left-hand end of the x-axis on that first panel, are the most likely estimates of that parameter given your data used it in the model. And as you fix that reporting rate at higher and higher values, the data support those parameter estimates less and less. And on the right side is a likelihood profile over the unfished recruitment from the stock synthesis model without the tag recapture data. And this shows a much more expected pattern in those estimates across the different values for that parameter, with a very defined lowest likelihood in the very bottom of that convex shape. And then as you get further and further away from that most likely parameter estimate, the likelihood increases, suggesting a less likely parameter value. So given these data conflicts that were observed when we included the tag recapture data, there is the potential for different weightings of the different data components in your model to have significant impacts on your model estimates. And so what we tried to do here is to adjust the weighting of the different data components, specifically the tag recapture data, to see what kind of influence that had on the model. And just a quick note here on that. The model was generally insensitive to these alternative weighting scenarios. One tendency was to estimate a more depleted stock than the base model, which we reviewed a couple meetings ago, as the weighting of the length composition data is decreased and or the weighting of the conditional agent length data is increased. Another analysis we did here was to look at external tag recapture model estimates. So we used the program MARC, which is a tag recapture modeling software, and looked at what the estimates from those models were. However, this was very limited in what we could do because of how the data had to be treated and how that was different and how they're treated in stock synthesis. So this didn't provide a lot of information on the differences in the estimates out of this type of a modeling approach and out of stock synthesis. But it did highlight this pattern that we see here. These are the tag recapture data matrices for age 1 fish in the top matrix and age 0 fish in the bottom matrix. And this is the ratio of recapture rates in the tagging data that was used in Batchelor et al. 2008, which was a paper that we've referenced often with the 18% reporting rate estimates out of that paper, and then also the tag recapture data as it was used in stock synthesis. And this shows that the data used in that Batchelor et al. Paper consistently had a higher proportion of recaptures than in the stock synthesis data. And so this kind of suggested that possibly one of those, to explain the discrepancy in the reporting rate estimates, is this difference in the data that are used in the two different analyses. So what we did is we went back and we tried to manually adjust the recapture data to match the recapture rates in the Batchelor et al. Paper, but that did not have much effect on the model estimates, and actually those recapture rates had to be increased significantly before this tag recapture data agreed with the other data components in stock synthesis while returning a reporting rate that was much more expected given the published literature studies. And then these are the runs for the southern stock, the sensitivity runs. These are the annual SPR estimates with the black line showing the SPR estimates from the base model that was presented to the board. The dotted black line is the SPR estimates from the model with no tag recapture data. So you can see again there was little influence of taking that tag recapture data out. The blue line is the model run with reporting rate fixed at 18%. The red line is the model run with the reporting rate fixed at 60%. And then the dotted blue line are the SPR estimates from CDAR 18. So this model had a little bit more of the expected response to fixing that reporting rate, where it generally scaled the estimates up and down and more of a gradient, as opposed to two very drastically different solutions that the model was kind of going back and forth to. So the conclusions after looking at these different analyses, the tag recapture data currently have little influence in the SS3 models unless reporting rate parameters are fixed. But specifically for the northern model, fixing reporting rate parameters indicated model instability when looking at the likelihood profiles. And some conflicts in other data components are likely contributing to this model instability. So the recommendation moving forward is to not include tag recapture data in the current SS3 models with fixed reporting rates. It's noted that the data conflicts that were observed need to be addressed before including the tag recapture data with fixed reporting rates. In the last task, the statistical catch-at-age continuity runs, the board asks for an investigation of whether the previous statistical catch-at-age model would be useful for management, and if so, to conduct a continuity run for both regions. The board does not specify if the continuity run should only contain data sources used in CDAR 18 and leaves it to the discretion of the investigators to incorporate new data sources as they see fit. If it is believed additional data sources will significantly improve the performance of the statistical catch-at-age model, the board encourages these additions. So we did review the statistical catch-at-age model runs with data through 2013, which was our terminal year used in the stock synthesis modeling and carried forward for this analysis. The data changes were minimal, but they do include the addition of long line surveys now within the model, which index the adult relative abundance, and also some changes to the juvenile index choices in the southern stock. And so the recommendation from reviewing the model estimates from this modeling framework are not to use the, or to use the updated statistical catch-at-age model not as a continuity analysis, but rather as a preferred model for management advice. And this is based on some of the things that we've gone over reviewing these tasks, the data conflicts we've seen within the different data components of the stock synthesis model, and the need to determine the appropriate treatment of these data conflicts, and then also the departure of the SS3 model estimates from literature estimates, the CDAR 18 estimates, and now the updated statistical catch-at-age model estimates. I did note some data changes to the model relative to how it was configured for CDAR 18. And so that will require a peer review. So we'll be providing the results from these model runs to peer review for their determination on whether this is useful for management advice. And we hope to provide the results of the models and the review to the 2017 ASMFC winter meeting. So just bring it back and provide a summary of the recommendations. The technical committee recommends maintaining the SPR reference points. They recommend against managing red drums solely using juvenile F-based reference points. They do endorse the continuation of using age-structured models, and they suggest providing or reviewing the updated statistical catch-at-age models for management advice, and recommend to not use the SS3 model estimates until data conflicts and parameter discrepancies are resolved. So that concludes my presentations, and I'll take any questions.
Jeff, thank you very much for a lot of work. Are there questions? I would like to pose maybe a question to the board. Roy.
So if we follow all of that advice and we use the statistical catch-at-age model for management advice, then where does that leave us in terms of the status of the northern and southern stock relative to overfishing?
So I did not include results of the model runs in the presentation here today, just because I think the group feels that it's appropriate for the results to go to a peer review first to get their recommendation on whether those would be useful for management or not before providing those results.
Other questions? So you note that the data that were used here go through 2013. I think there's a question about whether we would like to have that updated through 2015 if possible, and then maybe, if that's important, discuss the timing and about how we would do that. Robert.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to go ask that question of Jeff or Tony. Can you give us a sense of timing on if we were to update the statistical catch-at-age model with data through 2015, what kind of timing we would be to be able to get to Dr. Crabtree's $64,000 question?
So if we do not update the data and we just use data through 2013, we can get you the results of this peer review assessment in February, but it would only be through 2013. If we wanted to update the data and then give you the results, it depends on how much time it'll take the states to pull that information together, what type of priority you give your staff to work on that, whether or not we could get that completed by the May meeting or the August meeting. I think we can definitely do it by the August meeting, potentially by May. I think you have two avenues that you could move forward. In both avenues, I think by updating the data, it would either be May or August. You could follow sort of what we did with TATOG, where we had an assessment. It was through an earlier time set, so go ahead and do it, the review, get the results in with the 2013 data in February, and then immediately do an assessment update with the most recent data, which wouldn't need to be peer-reviewed later. The flip side is you could task the group to get the new years of data, include it, and then do your peer review. So that peer review would come in either May or August. In either case, the most recent data would be May or August, depending on your staff's time.
Robert?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, speaking very parochially, I mean, this is a very important fishery for us in South Carolina. I think everybody recognizes that. Either of those time frames, as you all know, y'all have heard me pontificate before about our legislative process. So our legislature goes home in May this year. And so all else equal, given the fact that we won't have anything for us necessarily to have in our pocket as we go talk to our General Assembly, I think I would just as soon update it through 2015. That would be my sense, and have the most up-to-date information that we have, so that should we need to make additional management changes, we've got the benefit of the most recent data.
other comments about that issue? Are there any objections to updating it through 2015? Yes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still kind of mulling through the options. The one given, that was similar to what was done with Tautog seems intriguing, since this has been a pretty long process to get where we are today. And we have a peer review assessment in place, and then we can start soon after that on a data update. With possibly one advantage of that is if we're into 2017, it could include 2016 information as well. The other side of it is although data through 2013 is a little old, this is a long-lived fish, so it probably lends itself better to red drum as opposed to, say, spot, where it would be a couple generations past. I guess the question for whichever scenario is how will that impact other stock assessments that are currently being done by the Commission?
Most of this work has been done by Angela out of Maryland, and so that would be a question to Lynn of what her workload is. Jeff has been helping her with a couple of parts of this, and Jeff is essential in a couple other assessments that we're moving down the line. If Angela takes the brunt of that work to update that, I can't answer that question, but you all have staff members that would need to be updating their data sets, and you all know how long that can or cannot take. So as I said before, it'd be how much of a priority you would give your staff members to work on those.
Lynn?
Yeah, thank you. And I really, Angela and the team as a whole, they are heroes. They have been working very hard on this. So I can't answer right now what Angela's ability would be. I would need to go back and circle back with her. I might need to medicate her, but we can certainly follow up. By however you want us to follow up, by email or however, to see what we can do.
Joe and then Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't just say thank you to everybody. There was an incredible amount of work put into this, and we would certainly do whatever needs to be done to help Angela with the update of the Northern model. And I just wanted to make one plug, I think, and I wouldn't stand against a motion from Robert in the opposite direction, but for a path forward like TOG, because I think it would give staff a chance to know whether or not we have any major errors in what we're dealing with before we put more work into this. There's been an incredible amount of work. If the peer review says what was done is solid, and now going forward all we have to do is that update, I think I'm pretty comfortable with that procedure. Thank you.
Roy?
Well, this is certainly an important assessment, and there's no getting around it. 2013 is getting to be a concern, but I do think this is something that we're going to need to begin to deal with the management implications sooner rather than later. And so I hope that we can find a path forward that allows us to begin talking about what actions need to be taken to deal with some of these issues as quickly as we can.
Any other questions or comments before I try to summarize things? Robert? So it sounded like what I heard was some interest in getting a review of the data through 2013, and then immediately following up and update that through 2015 or 2016. Does that satisfy everyone? If not, let's discuss it some more. Any objections to that plan? Jeff, does that give clear direction?
Yeah, that's clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your work. Next agenda item is Jeff again. He's going to give a progress update on spot and croaker stock assessments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So since I last gave an update at the August meeting, we had right after that, a second assessment workshop in August at our office in Arlington. And we also have had several progress calls since that assessment workshop. Right now we're putting the final touches on a catch survey, a two-stage catch survey analysis type model for spot, and a stock synthesis model for croaker. And we'll be having a few more calls to review that work and the additional work that needs to be done for those modeling approaches, and then putting that information into the final report, which will go to the technical committee, and then subsequently the peer review, and then we'll be scheduling the peer review. So if there are any questions on those assessments, I can take those now.
Any questions on that? Seeing none, we'll roll right along. I think next agenda item is plan reviews, and Amy's going to give plan reviews for Spanish mackerel, black drum, and spotted sea trout.
Okay, can you hear me? So we're going to go over the Black Drum 2016 FMP review. This covers both the 2014 and 2015 fishing years. Sorry, okay, so the following graphs represent black drum harvest within the management unit from New Jersey to Florida. And looking at total harvest, I wanted to point out a recent 2012 low point of less than 1 million pounds. It's after a spike in 2013, landings again dropped 21% to 1.42 million pounds in 2014, which is under review, and then remained relatively constant in 2015 at 1.48 million pounds. So these past 2 years have been about 30% below the previous 10-year average, which was inflated by the 2008-2009 recreational harvest spike. Commercial harvest is relatively stable, accounting for only 19% and 16% of the total in 2014 and 2015. 2014 landings decreased 8% from the previous year and then dropped again by 9% to 238,000 pounds in 2015. And Florida and Virginia led the 2014 commercial harvest, and Virginia led the 2015 harvest with 39%. Recreational landings indicate that fewer but larger fish are being caught in recent years. The number of fish harvested continues to drop at 166,000 fish in 2015, but catch and pounds actually rose last year to 1.25 million pounds. So this decrease in numbers can be attributed to the establishment of minimum sizes by the 2013 FMP, but the increased poundage is likely due to increased monitoring in the Mid-Atlantic region. And the 2015 harvest represents a 62% decrease in numbers, but only a 35% decrease in pounds from the previous 10-year average. And Florida anglers landed 60% of the 2015 recreational harvest. Okay, so that is the longest slide we have out of all of these. So hopefully we can get through the rest of this pretty quick. So the yellow portion of the bar shows the proportion of recreational harvest that was released. Percentage of releases has increased drastically over the last few years. From 47% released in 2013, releases increased to 71% in 2014, and again to 90% in 2015. Actual releases totaled 720,000 in 2014 and 1.5 million in 2015. And this recreational discard mortality is estimated at 8%. And we can also attribute this steep increase in releases to the minimum size established by the 2013 FMP. The yellow portion of the bar shows the proportion of recreational harvest that is released. And in the interest of time, we can just say, what? Oh, okay, sorry, good. The yellow portion, oh, why are these all messed up? What happened? What? I did, oh. Okay, sorry. The FMP requires states with a declared interest to implement a maximum possession limit by 2014 and a minimum size limit of 14 inches or more by 2016. Sorry about the technical difficulties. So the PRT pulled the state-specific requirements. Okay, and all states met the possession and size limits stated by the FMP. Is it going to go now? Okay. As stated in the previous slide, the PRT finds that all states have implemented the FMP requirements, and also no state requested de minimis in either 2014 or 2015. So after that, hopefully not too confusing review, are there any comments or questions?
Questions? Any actions anybody would like to take? Would you like to accept the FMP review and grant de minimis to the states that she pointed out? Malcolm?
Yes, I move that the board accept the Spanish mackerel compliance report as presented. Or the FMP and compliance report for black drum, I'm sorry.
Do I have a second? Well,
I'm looking backwards.
okay, so the motion is to move to accept the FMP review and compliance reports for the black drum 2014-2015 fishing years. Motion by Dr. Rhodes and seconded by Dr. Laney. Are there any objections to the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes unanimously. Okay, Amy, next.
Okay, cross your fingers. Okay, now we're going to go over the Spanish mackerel FMP review, which covers only the 2015 fishing year. Oh, now we're good. Okay, so total Spanish mackerel landings in 2015 are estimated at 3 million pounds, which is a 1.4 million pound decrease from last year, and both commercial and recreational landings have been in general decline for the past few years, aside from a few upticks. So the commercial fishery harvested approximately 70% of the total, and the recreational fishery about 30%. Coast-wide commercial landings have generally been below 4 million pounds since 1995, which was when Florida banned entanglement nets, since they are historically the largest harvester. Coast-wide commercial harvest in 2015 totaled 2.3 million pounds, a 1 million pound decrease from the previous year, and Florida is responsible for 75% of that harvest. Okay, now check out the trend in recreational landings, because we're about to break that down. Recreational anglers harvested about 628,000 Spanish mackerel, or 695,000 pounds in 2015. And this is a 29% decrease from last year and a 44% decrease from the local 2013 peak of 1.1 million pounds. North Carolina recently passed Florida to lead recreational landings with 61% number of fish in 2015. And South Carolina also passed this year with 21%, leaving Florida in third with 13%. And this is the first year that South Carolina is responsible for a large proportion of the recreational landings. The percentage of recreational releases has generally increased over time and was higher than ever before in 2015, with 65% of fish released. A stock assessment was completed through CDAR in 2012, which incorporated data through 2011, and it determined that the stock was not overfished or experiencing overfishing. So to save time, here are the Commission's regulations for Spanish mackerel. That includes the minimum length bag limit and commercial trip limit. But the one important thing to note is that Addendum 1 introduced a pilot program which allows states to reduce the minimum size of their commercial pound net fishery from July to September. They can lower the minimum size to 11.5 inches to reduce discards of slightly undersized fish. And the reason why I brought that up was because North Carolina implemented this pilot program. They did so from July 4th to September 30th. And the state regs table behind me is meant to illustrate that all the states are complying with the minimum size recreational creel limit and commercial trip limit. So the PRT finds that all states have implemented the requirements of the FMP. Also, New Jersey, Delaware, and Georgia request de minimis status, and the PRT notes that these states meet the requirements. And that's it.
Questions, comments, actions? Malcolm.
I'll try not to have a technical glitch. I move that the board accept the Spanish mackerel compliance reports and FMP, noting that Georgia, New Jersey, and Delaware be granted de minimis status.
Second? John Clark. Yes, sir. Malcolm, are you okay with saying approved de minimis? Okay, so the motion is move to approve the FMP review and compliance reports for Spanish mackerel 2015 fishing year and approve the de minimis status for Georgia, New Jersey, and Delaware. Motion by Dr. Rhodes, seconded by Mr. Clark. Are there any objections to the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes unanimously. One more time, Amy.
Mr. Chair.
Joe.
Before we move up Spanish mackerel, it was on the same timeline. Well, the last CDR assessment timeline was the same as cobia, so I was just wondering if we could get an update on when Spanish mackerel may be coming back around. Thanks.
So that we were looking into doing and probably trying to do a standard assessment, so an update of Spanish in a couple of years. I think it was fitting in either 2018 or 2019.
Okay, last one. Spotted sea trout 2016 FMP review covering the 2015 fishing year. Okay, so the following graphs represent sea trout harvest within the management unit from Maryland to Florida. 2015 saw 1 million pounds landed in total, which is a 0.8 million decrease from 2014. Commercial landings seen in blue here were 175,000 pounds, roughly half of last year's commercial total. And all states saw a decrease in commercial landings except for South Carolina, which increased their commercial landings. Florida accounted for about a third of the total coastwide catch last year, and North Carolina came in second with 27%. Leaders in commercial landings were North Carolina with 73%, followed by Florida with 22%. And check out the trend in green recreational landings and the low point you see in 2015, because the next slide will break that down. Okay, so the following graphs represent sea trout harvest. Oh, what the heck? Okay, here's the rec landings broken down by harvest and release. Looking at catch in black, you can see a general upward trend to an 8.8 million fish peak in 2012. This is followed by a decline in recreational catch over the past few years, so right now we're at a local low point of 5.7 million fish in 2015. Recreational harvest, which you can see in red, has remained relatively stable throughout the time series with a 1.3 million fish average, but over the past few years we have seen a decline with a record low in 2015 at 534,000 fish. So this is 52% lower than last year, 71% lower than the 2012 peak, and Florida and Georgia both led this harvest about 30% each. The low harvest in the past few years could be attributed to a recent increase in releases, which you can see in green, and these are on the rise, probably due to increasing catch and release trends, as well as season closures and size and bag limits in place. So the highest release percentage ever seen was in 2015 at 90.6%, and the previous 10-year average has been about 80. Okay, so the 12-inch minimum total length required by the 2011 amendments shows that all states have complied. Oh. And the PRT finds that all states have implemented requirements of the FMP. Also, New Jersey and Delaware request continuation of de minimis status, and the PRT notes that these states meet the requirements of de minimis. And that is the end of the presentation.
Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Amy, did you suggest spotted sea trout commercial landings are up in 2015 in South Carolina?
Let's take a look. Let me see. In South Carolina, commercial landings, according to the data that was submitted with the compliance reports, did increase in 2015. Or do you think something different? Because I can check that.
We've not changed spotted sea trout regs in a number of years, and it's a game fish. We'll have to look into that.
Okay,
So
I can look at that and get back to you. Yeah, I'll check that out.
Roy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amy may not be able to answer this, but I'm just curious if we know why there's a increasing trend in releases of spotted sea trout when, if my recollection is that management's been fairly constant over the years for that particular fishery, or at least since early 2000s anyway. Thank you.
Anybody want to try that?
Roy, we can bring it back to the PRT and ask them if they have any information on why they think we're seeing these shifts, and come back to the board at the next meeting and follow up.
Yeah, it just kind of out of curiosity, I'm wondering if it's a paradigm shift in the way people fish, or whether it's something else going on here with the increased number of releases. Thanks.
Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to answer at least from the fishery in North Carolina. 2015, we had another cold stun event that had an impact on the legal size fish. So and actually had a cold stun in 2014 as well. So the landings in North Carolina went down as a result of that. There was pretty decent recruitment following up, which most of those fish were below the minimum size limit, and the releases were high. And in 2016, I think we'll see that those fish have moved into the minimum size limit, and our harvest will be higher this year than it was last year, and probably 2014 as well. The other point too is although really haven't been very many changes at the ASMFC level as far as regulations go, the states have made changes, and North Carolina increased their minimum size limit from 12 inches to 14 inches around 2009, plus or minus a year. So that certainly had an impact on the harvest in our state. Thank you.
Joe?
Just to follow up, yeah, Virginia did decrease the bag limit, but I also think that that there's been an increasing trend in the fishery for catch and release as well. So,
any other questions? Dr. Rose, did you have something? In fact, I think we already have maybe typed up what you were thinking, if you'll just wait for a second.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I would move to accept the FMP review and compliance reports for spotted sea trout for 2015 fishing year and approve de minimis status for New Jersey and Delaware.
They have a second. Pat Gear. Okay, so the motion is to move to accept the FMP review and compliance reports for the spotted sea trout 2015 fishing year and approve de minimis status for New Jersey and Delaware. Motion by Mr. Voiles and seconded by Mr. Gear. Are there any objections to approval of the motion? Seeing none, it passes unanimously. Last item on our agenda is Shanna's going to give us an update about CMAP funding.
So I'm going to make this brief and depressing. Funding updates are not usually good. So CMAP decided that we wanted to give a quick update to the South Atlantic Board regarding our funding. Just as a reminder, ASMFC actually coordinates the portion of the program in the South Atlantic, but CMAP also includes stretches through the Gulf and Caribbean as well. So the graph that you're looking on at the screen is our overall funding for all three of those components. Obviously, since CMAP South Atlantic data supports a lot of the management species in the South Atlantic Board, we thought that it was important to kind of bring some of our funding issues to your attention. So if you'll look at the graph on the screen, it represents our funding over the past few years. Our congressional appropriation to the overall program is the one that's represented in blue, while the actual funds that our program receives are in red. And so as you'll see, although our congressional appropriation has increased since 2013, the amount available to our surveys to actually collect the data is decreasing. One of these reasons is because the taxes and assessments that are being levied on the program now constitute about 16% of our budget, when back in 2014 they were only about 5%. CMAP is also recently struggling with the impacts of just level funding. Obviously, survey costs increase, personnel costs increase, and being consistently on level funding obviously causes a lot of funding gaps that we're trying to address. Throughout the years, CMAP has historically depended on a lot of historical funding sources from either states or other granting agencies to maintain their current capacity, but obviously those funding sources are seeing a lot of the same cuts and starting to dwindle as well. The reductions in our funding have definitely impacted our surveys greatly. That can come out as reductions in sea days, reductions in the number of stations sampled, and sometimes we're getting rid of entire programs. So essentially the slides that I have following are going to kind of briefly outline some of the reductions that we're seeing in our CMAP programs since 2011. So the first, the Coastal Trawl Survey has been in effect since 1986. It's providing long-term fishery-independent data, seasonal abundance, biomass, and the survey overall has provided data to Spanish mackerel, menhaden, spot, croaker, just to name a few of the species. So with the reductions that we've seen in funding there, we've actually cut our sampled stations from 201 to 112. We've also saw a large reduction in the collection and processing of important life history information, including the elimination of all of our diet studies for that survey. Essentially, should CMAP funding remain level or continue to decrease, we're starting to think about losing one of our entire sampling seasons. So we usually hit spring, summer, fall. We would get rid of one of those. So next, focusing in on our reef fish survey. Reef fish survey data has been included in stock assessments for black sea bass, blue line tilefish, and a lot of various species in the snapper grouper complex. Unfortunately, with the reductions in funding available to this survey, we've completely eliminated our gag ingress sampling component and reduced our sea days down from 35 to 19. We expect that should our funding remain level, this survey should see a further reduction in sea days or the loss of their entire long-line sampling component. They are also considering decreasing a lot of their life history processing. So overall, the impact on our coastal longline surveys, which are the ones that are collecting all of that useful data for red drum and coastal sharks, we've seen in South Carolina, we've already reduced our sea days from 15 to 10. Should CMAP remain at a level or decreased funding, we've discussed making a lot of changes to the Georgia longline survey, either reducing our sea days by half, modifying how we sample, or getting rid of an entire sampling season or area. In North Carolina, they're discussing reducing their sea days by about a week. So some of our plans that we're going to do to try to tackle some of these issues is we are going to meet with the CMAP South Atlantic Committee. This is our oversight committee, and we'll meet in conjunction with some of the survey leads from our coastal surveys and from our longline surveys to discuss how we want to modify these surveys based on our budget constraints. And these aren't good modifications. It's important to note that we really don't know what's going to happen if we continue to reduce sea days and reduce stations sampled, because obviously we're losing all of that data, and that might have some unintended consequences on a lot of the stock assessments that this board is going to see in the future. It's also worth noting that many of our surveys do anticipate an increase in their personnel costs due to the Fair Labor Standards Act. I know a bunch of the states are facing the same issue. And so we might face further sampling reductions in the future should our funding remain level or decreasing. And essentially, since you all know where our data is coming from and it's supporting the management of the species on this board, we just wanted to bring these funding issues up front and center to let you all know what the situation is. We're definitely meeting, as you see, in the spring, and we're going to start to discuss how to put together maybe a few letters to potentially reduce some of the taxes that are being levied on the CMAP program, but it's not going to cover a lot of the gaps and a lot of the struggles that we're already facing. So with that, I'm going to let you all be sad for a little while.
Thank you, Shanna. John.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just curious, where's that 16% in taxes going?
So essentially what happened was before, when we were about at the 5%, we were only being taxed through headquarters. And we were lucky enough that the Southeast Fisheries Science Center was not imposing any overhead on us, which they technically can. But just recently they were told that they had to. And so that's where the large increase in taxes is coming from.
Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shanna, thank you for the excellent presentation and representation of what's going on with CMAP. A question for Bob, perhaps. Bob, we learned a lot, I think, with meeting with NIMS leadership back in August, and even at the state directors meeting, that a lot of this, perhaps one way to address this is to get programs like these added to the ATBs, the adjustments to base, as part of the NOAA budget. Is that a realistic avenue for us to perhaps begin chipping away at this erosion of buying power?
I guess the answer is hopefully. We've been focusing on Atlantic Coastal Act for the most part recently to try to get that adjusted more consistent with the increase that that line item has seen in the budget. So we have not focused a lot on CMAP yet. However, Dave Donaldson from the Gulf States Commission, Randy Fisher from the Pacific States Commission, and I will be meeting with appropriations staff next Thursday, I believe it is, Deke. So, and one of the common areas that Dave Donaldson from the Gulf and I always bring up is CMAP. And one of the priority areas, it affects the Gulf, obviously, and the Caribbean and us. And it's one of the priority areas that we try to convey the importance to the appropriations folks on the Hill. So we'll do that. I think I'll pull some of the pieces out of Shanna's presentation and let them know that where we are right now, there's real world cuts. Things are disappearing pretty quickly. Stock assessments will be impacted, and the ability to manage these fish will be impacted. So we'll keep working on it. It's a pretty tight time to get money out of the Hill right now, but we'll just keep trying.
Any other questions? Shanna.
I just wanted to mention that in your meeting materials, there's actually a letter that outlines in further detail the cuts to both the South Atlantic and the Gulf programs, if anybody's interested in seeing those in more depth.
So there'll be more discussion about this issue, I expect, in February when we meet. Is there any more business to come before the board? Yep. Yes. Oh, Tina, I am sorry. I forgot.
I just want to quickly go over, you have 4 new nominations to the South Atlantic Species Advisory Panel. They are Aaron Kelly from North Carolina, Bill Parker from South Carolina, Glenn Ulrich from South Carolina, and Lee Southward from Georgia. And I present them for the board's approval today. Thank you.
Okay, do we have a motion? Malcolm.
Yes. I move the board accept Captain Bill Parker, Glenn Ulrich, Lee Southard, and Aaron Kelly to the COBIA management, or COBIA South Atlantic Advisory Panel.
There you go.
Thank you.
Second, Chris? Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, it passes unanimously. Now let me try again. Is there any more business before the board? Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn? I think I see Pat. We're adjourned. Thank you.
Quickly, before everyone takes off for lunch, there are 2 cruise ships in town, so apparently the restaurants are pretty full, but we'll still try to get the Tautog board going as close to 1:30 as we can, but if we realize that a lot of folks are jammed up in restaurants, we may have to delay that a little bit. So do the best you can on lunch, and we'll try to get Tautog going as quick as we can. Does that sound good, Adam?